Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
Change organizations.
Change the world.
I'd like to begin with just a little bit of context. The genesis of the Global Crossroads Conference came about through discussions many of us were having with our colleagues across Stanford, as well as those outside the university, about the increasingly complex nature of the global economy. We thought it was important to host an event like this at the Graduate School of Business. We look forward to a lively academic discourse, a candid exchange of ideas between researchers and practitioners, and most importantly, the opportunity to explore and develop the next areas for research and learning in the area of global policy studies. When we put on our political economist hats, I think we should be fascinated by the incredible interconnectedness of the world today. Politics meets economics, meets finance, which reverberates across countries and the world. The GSB, for its part, has never had a greater global focus. Our curriculum emphasizes the importance of communicating cross-culturally. Our global study trips deliver experiences that cannot be taught in the classroom. Our global speaker series brings in leaders from Europe, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and beyond. Our faculty, our students, and our culture are more international than ever. More than that, communications technologies have brought us even closer together. Whether we're using HD video conferencing to put Stanford students into a virtual classroom with students in India or China, or whether we're delivering online classes live to hundreds of thousands of students, we are rapidly advancing into an era where geographic borders will be much less important than the technology that connects us. Tonight we have what I think is a very interesting program format. We're going to hear from two people who have spent most of the past 30 years immersed in national security policy and intelligence matters, defense issues, and international policy issues. They bring two distinct perspectives, one from inside government, having served in the US State Department, the UN, and in a range of government advisory roles, and the other from outside government, having worked as an international correspondent, bureau chief, and security analyst in some of the most fascinating places across the globe. I could not think of two more interesting people to have with us tonight to set the stage for the rigorous discussions we'll have over the next 24 hours. The topic of tonight's discussion is political change, the role of the US and the UN. It's my pleasure to introduce Zalmay Khalilzad, who will serve as the inside expert, and Phil Taubman, who will serve as the outside expert, moderator, and interviewer. Zal is a counselor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and president of Khalilzad Associates, an international business consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. He served as the United States ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush. He has been involved with US policymakers at the White House, State Department, and Pentagon since the mid-1980s, and was the highest-ranking Muslim American in the Bush administration. His previous assignments in the administration include US Ambassador to Afghanistan, US Ambassador to Iraq, and United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations. Philip Taubman is a consulting professor at CSAC, where he has completed a book project about nuclear threats and the joint effort of Sid Drell, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, Bill Perry, and George Shultz to reduce nuclear dangers. Before joining CSAC in the fall of 2008, Phil worked at the New York Times as a reporter and editor for nearly 30 years. He specialized in national security issues including intelligence and defense policies and operations. At the time, Phil served as a Washington correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, deputy editorial page editor, Washington bureau chief, and associate editor. Please give a warm GSB welcome to Zal and Phil.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I know I can speak for both of us. And thank you, Garth, for helping to organize this and to invite the two of us to speak. So I can't think of a better way to frame the discussion than to recall some words uttered by Colin Powell in retrospective about the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent effort of the United States to help try to create a new democratic nation in Iraq. And you will probably recall some of these comments. Tom Friedman, a colleague of mine at the Times, claims to have coined the phrase, to have taken the line from the Pottery Barn about if you break it, you own it. I believe Tom did apply that for the first time to issues of international relations. And then Colin Powell was said to have used this phrase. But I'll read you exactly what Powell said when he was asked about this at an Aspen Institute gathering a number of years after the invasion. And I think at this point he was no longer serving as Secretary of State. It is said that I used the Pottery Barn rule, Powell said. I never did that. Tom Friedman did. But what I did say is that once you break it, you're going to own it. And we're going to be responsible for 26 million people standing there looking at us. And it's going to suck up 40 to 50% of the Army for years to come. And it's going to take all the oxygen out of the political environment. And frankly, when military action was undertaken, it looked like it was extremely successful. It was a lack of planning for the later phases and the things that got out of control that has really brought us to this very difficult point. So you are someone who is intimately familiar with the American experience in Iraq and Afghanistan. So let me start just by asking you, it probably, would you agree that it's correct to say that we're better at breaking the crockery than putting it back together?
I would agree that, first, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I would agree that once we go in and take down a government, we have a great responsibility in helping the people of the country to put a new system that's better than the previous system together. But I would not agree with the proposition that once we have overthrown the government, we own the place. That overstates our kind of role in putting the place together. Because there are other owners also. There are local actors who are very important. There are regional players who are also very important. So I would say that the United States, after taking down a government, has a great deal of responsibility and influence in shaping things. But it would be an overstatement to say that we could do whatever we want politically in shaping the future or determining or deciding the future. So the question really becomes, how do we play our role effectively to get a new national compact among the people of the country that is acceptable and workable to them, but also reflects some key universal values. How do you get the institutions of the country to get started and get stronger over time? How do you get its economy, helping them to move forward? I would say that as far as our record as to which one we're good at more than the other, we are, in my judgment, pretty good at obviously the military operations side. In the initial overthrow phase, we are pretty good at, in my view, in building security institutions. We are also have done relatively well in terms of getting political agreements, but I would say less good than on the military issues. And on the institution building, some institutions we are good at, some not, and it depends on the circumstances. We have been relatively good at sort of encouraging the expansion of civil society, but not at the buildup of effective political parties to assist with that. If the ownership thing applies, in one thing where I have had, based on personal experience, some frustration, is where we go in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, overthrow the government. But when it comes to politics, we exercise some self-imposed limitations that I think can be counterproductive, and I'll give an example of that. Secretary Rice is there. She would I'm sure, remember some of this discussion quite well, because she was one of the deciders on this issue. Is elections we think are very important after a constitution, and we spent a lot of money, a lot of lives, but we do not provide effective assistance, in my view, in elections to parties that share a kind of a moderate or a liberal democratic values. We used to do it quite well in one phase of our history. During the initial phases of the Cold War, we assisted parties competing against communists in Europe, Southeast Europe. Now, the kind of assistance we provide for political parties is sort of available to everyone, from Islamists to non-Islamists. And I believe that sometimes some of our adversaries, using, elections cost money, and you providing resources, can affect the politics of the country in a way that creates security challenges that we respond to. Or our adversaries use our kind of success in breaking, as you called it, an overthrow, to use as an opportunity to use our action as a facilitator of their success, sort of with lesser effort, while we do the heavy lifting because of our political limitations that are self-imposed. And I think this is an area where it still has relevance and will have relevance for some time to come, as you see changes in the broader Middle East that are underway right now.
So it's interesting when you make a point. If you think back to the early years after World War II, and the fear that communism was going to spread across Western Europe, Greece particularly, Italy, other places, the United States was actually quite aggressive in the use of CIA money to influence elections, to try to guarantee that the outcome we wanted would take place. And it makes me wonder, when we think about these things today, are we too idealistic in a funny way about elections? Are our expectations too high when we say we're going to have help to encourage an election in Iraq? There were, of course, elections in various parts of the Middle East that didn't turn out the way we would have liked. Do you think we've sort of gone from being cynical and very pragmatic, perhaps, to being overly idealistic?
Well, I think we do emphasize elections as a measure of the democratic success to determine the will of the people. There has been always an argument in places like Iraq and Afghanistan whether we insisted on elections too soon, that we perhaps should have waited. But there are, of course, in every case, issues with regard to the consequence of waiting. For example, in Iraq, there was not an agreement before the first election among all communities with regard to this national compact. First the election took place, then the constitution. And some people in Iraq, the prime minister at that time, Ayad Alawi, and the Sunni Arabs of Iraq wanted a delay in the election. But the Shiites, who were the largest number, with Ayatollah Sistani and the Kurds, were insisting on election as soon as possible. So the U.S. had a role, but I go back to my point that we're not even in post-invasion, are not the sole kind of determinants. And therefore, elections took place. But my sense is, at least my judgment is that maybe there were some excesses in the early years of the Cold War period that led to kind of limitations being put that you have to have a finding in order to interfere or as it is or affect the elections, and therefore you have to brief members of Congress and it gets leaked, and then therefore the whole thing gets damaged. But as a nation, I believe that we need to take another look as to if we're going to spend the military efforts that we do, and if we do the other sacrifices, economic and financial, that we do, how do we kind of help on this path, on the political parties and elections, perhaps more effectively, because that pillar is a key thing, a key factor in shaping the future, and not. I don't think a single approach will be effective. In some places, it would have to be done covertly, because overtly they will not take it. But in some places, people are willing to take it, support from sister parties, through sister parties, or even from governments more overtly. I would be demand-driven and see what the parties or the actors would like, but we need to find, in my view, a mechanism to have a level playing field, I would call it, rather than kind of being aggressive to support one side against the other, because our restraint in this domain is not shared by everyone regionally. For example, in the case of Iraq, the Iranians were quite aggressive in helping certain parties. So it is to sort of ensure a level playing field.
So that's sort of a natural segue, I guess, for a moment to talk about the UN. I know you probably vividly remember this, and I'm sure Secretary Rice does, that the bombing of the UN headquarters in Baghdad and the death of Sergio De Meo. Right. This was a terrible setback at the time. It makes me think, might things have played out differently in Iraq if that hadn't happened? And as you think about the application of the UN in these kinds of situations, is there a useful role for the UN in nation building?
Yes, I'm a strong believer, and that sometimes got me in trouble with some folks in saying that. But I think in Afghanistan, my experience was that working effectively between us as the most important player on the ground and the UN was a very effective, because the UN has a degree of authority and legitimacy that can be as a convener, as a facilitator, as a means to communicate messages, at a certain expertise in elections areas because of a tremendous experience around the world that no other kind of entity really in some circumstances can duplicate. For example, in the case of Iraq, we could communicate with Mr. Sistani, a key player, but we did not meet with him openly, and the UN could. Muqtada Sadr, another key Shiite player who's resurfaced recently in Erbil, we didn't. Our relationship was quite hostile and strained with him. It fought, his forces and our forces fought each other, but yet the UN could go visit with him, and if the UN convened a meeting, they would attend. Mm-hmm. We couldn't. That was less of an issue in Afghanistan. But even in Afghanistan, I think the UN, because of in part the persons that were sent by the UN, and in part because of the UN, it was helpful. So I believe in terms of getting to a national compact, in agreement on the Constitution, generally the UN role is important because you have to bring diverse forces to agree as to how they're going to decide on the future of the country, what kind of a constitution, what kind of political system, what sort of relationship, in the case of the Middle Eastern countries, between Islam and civil laws, universal commitments, the UN can play a useful role. And again, to go back to this ownership versus local responsibility and role, here was two countries that we went and took down their regimes. They have two very different constitutions. That shows it wasn't an American kind of cookie-cutter approach. Now that we have taken the government down, here is your constitution, so to speak. The Afghans, because they had suffered from the absence of a strong government for some time, they had lived in an anarchic environment, they went for a strong unitary state with a lot of power residing in the office of the president of the country. Iraq, which had suffered under a very strong centralized government, did the opposite, which is to go for a parliamentary system, federal system, with strong limitations on the powers of the executive, nearly requiring consensus, at least 2/3 on key decisions of vote of parliament to get anything done, because they were fearing a kind of too strong a central government. But I think that in those things, there's a big role for the UN.
I think a lot of Americans think of Afghanistan as a country that's never been governed in a enlightened way, a country that has managed to repulse invaders over the years, going all the way back, to Alexander the Great, and of course the Russians came in and they were evicted, and now we're there. And I think as someone who grew up in Afghanistan, I think it'd be very interesting for you to talk a little bit about the history of Afghanistan and whether you think that history makes it a good or not so good prospect for some kind of democratic evolution.
Well, Afghanistan, depending on kind of your horizons, time-wise, it has had some very glorious periods in its history, because it's the country is relatively kind of as old as we are. The United States, about 300 years under this kind of name. But the territory is 5,000 years of civilization. There were periods where it was perhaps the most advanced place in the world in terms of mining. During the Bronze Age, they were mining copper in Afghanistan. And there was a time that they were in some weapons production they were ahead. When the Brits were going to India, they were afraid of some of the weapons of the Afghans if they faced them. Or in agriculture, the Afghans used to assist India during the Babur period, the Mughals, with agriculture because they were sending what we do now, send experts to places. But then there were periods of darkness and huge setbacks. But in more recent period, and the setbacks generally have been associated in the historic period with either a barbaric and backward ruler or a foreign invasion, but they've then recovered. The Mongol invasion, the Genghis Khan's invasion of Herat, which was one of the great cities of the ancient time, the sort of the center of civilization, the city was leveled entirely. I think about a few dozen people survived this city, and then it re-emerged. If you look at the 20th century period history of Afghanistan, it's the progressive king who ruled for 40 years plus. And it was advancing. I was saying during dinner the story of my friend Ban Ki-moon, who I had the pleasure of working with when I represented the United States at the UN, who said that he was a political officer at the South Korean embassy in Delhi in the 1960s, and he covered Afghanistan from there. And whenever he used to go every 6 months to Afghanistan to update his reporting, he used to get orders from other embassies as to what to bring back from Afghanistan, because Afghanistan was much more of an open society where there was a lot of goods available that was not available in a more kind of controlled Indian economy at that time. And look how much the world has changed, where Afghanistan is, where India is. I think our current pessimism is due to the issue that whenever things become a little difficult, and we can discuss the causes for the current difficulties in Afghanistan, we tend to react in a caricature way, and that I would say in three ways, one of which is that we then start to say, first reaction is, this place has never worked. It has always been a source of problems. How dare did we think that we could go and fix a place like that by sending forces or developing a conception of the place that it could possibly work? Another reaction typically, and therefore, for the first reaction, we should get out and let them be, so to speak. And then another reaction is that, well, the problem is that there are different peoples and they have always hated each other and they're never going to get along. Can we divide the country in some way so that they can be separated from each other? And kind of a third reaction is typically that then we, well, may not be so typically rare on some rare occasions, but I have to say, look, maybe we have to do things differently, so to speak, because there is some problem with perhaps the way we currently are doing things. It's an issue with regard to our strategy. So, and I think my own judgment is that Afghanistan can work and can move. It will take time towards a democratic order of Afghanistan style, because, but two conditions are very important. One is, can there be an agreement between Afghanistan and Pakistan? It's a huge diplomatic challenge for us, has been for some time. Can we get an agreement between these two countries? Because one of the reasons for the problems with Afghanistan since we've been there has been the sanctuary for the insurgents and for the extremists and some terrorists who are also focused on Afghanistan in Pakistan. Pakistan has been a kind of both friend and adversary at the same time. And one can go through all the issues why. And second is that will we kind of maintain some sort of a supporting relationship until that issue is resolved, at least. But if we remove us from the picture, then I will be more pessimistic about in the short term at least, and that the conflict will intensify, and there are a variety of scenarios that the country could experience.
I should just say, as someone who served in the Moscow bureau of the New York Times during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, I spent some time in Kabul and Kandahar and elsewhere, coming out of Moscow, flying down, under the auspices of the Soviet Foreign Ministry, with a group of Western journalists. And your story about people coming from New Delhi, in the old days and finding more goods in Kabul. This was true in Moscow. From 1986, 87, you went from Moscow to Kabul. There were actually more consumer goods in Kabul than there were in Moscow.
Yeah.
You were in the very unusual position of having been ambassador to these two countries that we are now engaged in this kind of extraordinary
I didn't know what I did to
Yes.
deserve that funding. Dr. Rice will have to explain that.
But take us down to the kind of nitty-gritty a little bit. Take
Yes.
us kind of with you for some stories about how this really worked at the street level. When you were a U.S. ambassador, you're there, you're trying to help turn Iraq into a modern democratic state. You're trying to help turn Afghanistan into a modern democratic state. What exactly does that mean in your work and your life?
Well, yeah, of course, I went with specific tasks to work on, to achieve. In both countries, one of the big tasks that I had was to help them with the help of others too, including the United Nations, to get their constitutions, to build institutions. In the case of Afghanistan, in the aftermath of the overthrow, which had happened with our help, not with a lot of people on the ground, largely with special forces and air. You had a bunch of different variety of groups of Afghans who we had helped that overthrew the Taliban. And from many, so to speak, of militias to form national institutions, to cajole people like whose names probably people have forgotten, who was at one time quite, people knew about, General Dostum, who was a kind of a warlord of the north, to Ismail Khan, the kind of warlord of the west, to kind of warlord from the center, Khalili, and from the north west, Fahim Khan, and then some of the others in the south and east, to get them to behave in new ways and build these national institutions, while saying we do not object as such to them having a role in terms of this future, but no role within this new framework. And balancing that with people who, Afghans who thought that these people were war criminals, because there had been a period after the Soviet withdrawal when we disengaged from Afghanistan. And the Afghans fought each other, and some of these names that I just mentioned had been responsible for the destruction of Kabul. Those who went, like myself, after the Taliban, I hadn't been there. I had left Afghanistan the last time I had visited it before I went as a U.S. Special Envoy initially, was in 1972. So there had been a long period I hadn't been, and I was quite taken aback by the destruction of the city done. So there was very strong feelings on the part of the population against these. So I had very useful and sometimes amusing, sometimes a very difficult conversation with these people who thought, on the one hand, that given that they had played a role in the overthrow of the Taliban, they were entitled to everything and more, and the population who was quite negative towards them generally. And even among the modern elements who were from the technocratic class, there were fault lines. I mean, the greatest problem we faced in helping with the Afghan constitution at the end was between some ministers in the interim government, led by the foreign minister, Dr. Abdullah, who continues to be a player in Afghanistan, and some other ministers holding the constitution back because those who had not gone abroad and taken foreign citizenship, Dr. Abdullah, for example, were saying no one could be a minister if he was a dual national, while all the ministers who had come, mostly from Pashtuns, who had come from the former king of Afghanistan, who had gone to exile in Rome, had dual national. So this was a power play between the new and the people we were hoping would represent the future of Afghanistan, and it took quite a while. The process was held back because of this, this tension. So until a resolution was agreed to, which is really the president can nominate anyone, dual national or not, provided the parliament goes along. If the person is needed by the country and parliament approves, then it's okay. So a compromise had to be found. So there, I mean, you would be very surprised by the kind of the level of involvement of the United States and its representatives during the initial phase. I think it changes over time as they find their bearing in themselves. But in the initial phase, there is tremendous expectation, and there's unrealistic expectation sometimes that leads to disappointment, because the overthrow often takes place very quickly, and as it did. I mean, although some of you may recall that after the first couple of weeks or less in Afghanistan, people were talking about Afghanistan, oh, it's taking so long, and it's Vietnam, and we're going to lose. I mean, and people thinking about Afghanistan, given your description also of, you know, from Alexander the Great onward. But it actually turned out to be much easier than one would have anticipated. And that leads to expectations that these people who can do this in such a short time, they're obviously magicians. They can solve all problems that quickly if they want to. And the question, when things do not happen because they're much more complicated, it's not only up to us, but up to them too, and they're not doing their part. They think it must be that we have some other considerations we're not doing, what we obviously could do given what we did on the military front. So it's complicated.
So I'll ask one more question, and then I think we want people here to ask questions as well. Certainly there's no place in the world where political change is occurring at a faster clip than in the Arab world. And when you look at the Arab Spring and you think of what the United States role or the UN role or whatever outside role there might be to try to help encourage these revolutions to come out in a way that would be good for the peoples of those countries, and perhaps as a consequence they would also be favorable outcomes for the United States, what would you like to see happen at this point?
Well, first, I think change had to happen because the region this has been dysfunctional, in part because the governments of the area have not been producing for the people. There's tremendous unemployment, for example, across the Middle East, I think, especially among the young people. The numbers I've seen are as high as 40 million plus young Arabs are unemployed, as low as 20 somewhere. That's a large number that have not had jobs. They've been more educated than previous generations in recent time of the Arabs. There's been little opportunities for not only economic development, but also on kind of political participation. the dysfunctionality was a revolutionary gap, produced a revolutionary gap that was, I think, to some extent, the post-9/11 definition that the President and Dr. Rice and others talked about in the case of when talking about the region, that we had sought in the past because of our great concern about the Soviets, and that this region, we didn't really care as much about the kind of how they governed themselves as long as they were allied on the right side of the Cold War period. Post 9/11, it became clear that their internal issues were front and center because that produced extremism that in turn produced terror. And that the stability that one had sought was had been a false stability. Now, of course, in post-overthrow, there has been, of course, great uncertainty as to where things will end up, how long it will take for it to end up somewhere. That would be not only work for the people of the area, but also for the region and the world. My sense is that it's going to be different from countries, from country to country. I'm most concerned myself about the future of Egypt and Syria as the two countries with the greatest impact. Mm-hmm. Tunisia looks pretty promising. Libya, I think, is more complicated, and there is the risk. The greatest risk I see there is of a kind of warlordism and separation, or at least tensions. And I think I would have liked to see more progress on building national institutions and disarming militias. But the militias with ties to the outside powers or the infrastructure of civil war, so I do worry about that. But Egypt, which is the most important, is the issue of Islam and Islamism. My sense is that the economy, given the economic requirements of Egypt, and that provides us with the greatest leverage to help Egypt. It's happening at a time, unlike European changes, where, given our own economic situation, we're not in a position to do as much for them to help. The other Arab states, especially the oil-producing states, have benefited a lot financially from the impact of these changes on the price of oil, which has gone up. So they've had, I think, by some figures, maybe around $300 billion of additional income because of the increase in price, perhaps due to these changes. Could we play a role in putting together something of an Arab world Marshall Plan, with not working so much through the government, but encouraging the economy, but also having government buy-in? I also think that it would be quite important to have the more liberal and democratic elements, which played a great role in the overthrow, to move towards effective party formation, because the civil societies, which our society relates to well, and our technology assists, helps empower them. There are so many of them, but from so many, you need a few in terms of a political party to compete with programs and strategies to compete. But quite a few of the key leaders as Egypt was getting ready for elections, of the civil society that caused the overthrow, were in New York and so on, promoting books and how we did it, kind of thing, which is important, but rather than in establishing fewer political parties cooperating. I think there will be an empowerment of Islamic forces as a result in Egypt for some, but the question is the uncertainty is the Islamic Brotherhood is going to go the path of the Turkish AKP, which is having a tremendous impact on the region, or is it going to go the path of the Salafists? The struggle is, at this point, in part, depends on the future direction of the Islamic Brotherhood. Syria, I think, is a geopolitically vital country, which way in relation to Iran, and I think my sense is that the UN can't do more than what it's doing in the case of Syria because of the difference of view between us and the Russians, particularly, or the West and the Russians on this. So the it's doing what the Russians would allow it, so to speak, to do. So there is great limitations on it. But I think that on the side, I'm an advocate of expanding the opposition and developing a strategy for the opposition, and that can bring in communities that are fearful of the opposition. Syria has some 10% of its population is Kurdish, 12% are Christian, and then there are the Alawites that are even a larger number. And those three communities, by and large, have not bought into the change because they're fearful of the change. And I think that politically, an effort of the kind that needs to be made to bring in those communities into a strategy for change, and then to reassure people that it will not lead to an Islamist domination at the expense of those communities, I think would be helpful to both increasing the pressure on the regime to change and also making post-change less, shall we say, unpredictable and less potentially violent and kind of a civil war scenario.
My name is Kamal Naji. I'm an MBA student at the Stanford GSB. I'm from Qatar. Ambassador Khalilzad, thank you very much for coming. It's an honor to have you here. I have a two-part question regarding Afghanistan and Iraq. What is your view on Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's treatment of Tariq al-Hashmi, and how do you think, what do you see as the best path forward for this? And the second part question regarding Afghanistan is, when the US forces withdraw in 2014, do you honestly think the Afghan forces will be able to handle the situation? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. On Nouri al-Maliki and Hashmi, I think that Prime Minister Maliki has not done the right thing with regard to Tariq al-Hashmi. One, Tariq al-Hashmi was one of the Sunni Arab leaders that was initially against joining the political process in the initial period when the Sunnis were boycotting the political process largely. And when the constitution was being negotiated, still the Sunnis were largely going to go against it with the risk that the constitution was therefore not going to be ratified, because they could have influenced the votes in 3 provinces. If that 3 provinces had gone negative, the constitution wouldn't have been ratified. And it took an agreement that we helped facilitate for some front-load changes in the constitution that brought Tariq Hashmi and some Sunnis on board that allowed the constitution to be ratified. And because of his participation in that process, and because of joining the government, he paid a huge personal price. His 2 brothers and his sister were killed by Al-Qaeda as a response to that sacrifice, that change. Therefore, I don't know the specific details of what happened, this accusation, and that his some of his security may have been involved in killings. Unfortunately, quite a number of the groups have had that kind of background. I would have pardoned Tariq Hashmi in terms of the national interest and the sacrifice that he did because that is the power that exists in the office of the Prime Minister. He seemed a little too anxious to go to do this as if he was waiting for the U.S. forces to withdraw, and then he was going to pounce. It looks too much like that. So I think that he did not do. He has not treated Hashemi properly. And I've talked to other leaders of Iraq. I just came back. That was the day before yesterday in Iraq, actually. And there is a broad agreement that this, other than among some more sectarian Shiites, and there are sectarian Sunnis as well, who think it's good and that some big Sunni was being kicked by a Shiite leader, because there is unfortunately a polarization of Shia and Sunnis across the region to some degree. That's unfortunate. And there is concern about the implications of that for Iraq among other leaders as well. On Afghanistan, I think that there will be some, at least that's the hope, that's the plan, some residual U.S. forces that will stay in Afghanistan after 2014. I know that domestically, the rhetoric from the administration has been of we're getting out of Afghanistan, but the administration has been negotiating a post-2014 security and a broad agreement with the Afghans, including some residual forces staying there, not only because of Afghanistan to help with the training and institution building in Afghanistan, but also because although Al-Qaeda is weakened tremendously, but still is the problem, and some of the leaders are still across the border in the mountainous areas, Waziristan and so forth, of Pakistan. And therefore, there's still work to be done, and where would you conduct some of the operations that take place against those who still remain? And the best place to do it from, given other options, is Afghanistan. So we have kind of terrorism-related interests and Afghanistan-related interests that demand that perhaps for not permanently, not indefinitely, but for some time to come, and they're talking about another 10 years at least, 2014, 2024, a residual presence. But that, you don't rely on that military instruments alone. Of course, as Qatar, you said you are from Qatar, there is a discussion, prospect for also having some kind of reconciliation with those who are fighting the current system, who might be willing to reconcile. That has to go on, and the key thing I mentioned before, seeking some kind of an agreement with Pakistan and between Pakistan and Afghanistan would be important. Those factors would, I think, reduce the demand on sort of how much force we would need to maintain after 2014, and two, the Afghan institutions, how much of a challenge they will face. I have to say that the evaluation of the security institutions that have been built is differentiated. It's different. There's tremendous respect for Afghans, the Special Forces Division. Everyone thinks they are performing superbly in terms of morale, technical capabilities, execution. Other army units are, fair to good, but the police is not as good. I have to tell you that one of the issues, going back to the initial point, is that we started a little late in putting a lot of effort in building Afghan institutional security. We started right away, but it wasn't as big an effort as we did in Iraq, in part because of the resource issue. Iraq could do a lot more for itself to sustain itself, Afghanistan not. And the threat wasn't, one didn't see the threat to justify as big an effort as we faced, and we did. So it took a while before we really got underway. And I think now it looks better, and I think it would this transfer of responsibility more to the Afghans. While we have a significant presence there, I have very much support, because we can see them perform and take, when we are there in a significant effort, take the appropriate corrective measures. So I'm not pessimistic about the security forces. The Iraqi security forces have helped. So that's an analogy to keep in mind. We're not there. anymore, and the investment has paid off, although there are political issues that still need to be resolved in Iraq.
Henry Fernandez, member of the GSP Advisory Board.
Sure.
Ambassador, a question on Iran. It looked like a couple months ago things were coming to a head there. At least that's what the reports were. And it seems like the situation was diffused. Maybe you can elaborate on that if you don't mind. And secondly, and more importantly, how do you see the path there? Is there a path to confrontation, or there is some kind of negotiated solution to the problem?
Well, of course, there is a there is a path to conflict and a path to negotiations, and it really depends on on Iran largely. We certainly find more desirable to have a path to negotiation be realized, because the use of military force would have a lot of not only direct effect but second and third order effects, that some of which are unpredictable. But it really is in significant degree, in my view, given the position that the United States and some others have taken, that crossing a nuclear threshold is unacceptable, and that we would take appropriate measures, including the military measure. So is Iran going to test that proposition and cross that threshold? Of course, it depends on how you define that threshold exactly, because they have been working on the enrichment, and once you cross a certain threshold in terms of capability of enriching, you can, you need 5% enrichment for to fuel the reactor. You need significantly more enrichment in order to produce weapons material. And I don't know whether you can do the 5% without being able to do also the 70 or 80%. That's the dilemma. And that's why the world before the current discussions, the position was that the world be willing to guarantee a supply of 5% enriched uranium to Iran without Iran having to enrich it itself, because once they enrich it, it'd be difficult to really police it in a timely fashion if it enriches to higher percentages. We know they've been working on the weapon design and delivery systems, and they may have an effective design already that they've gotten through from another country. And so therefore, the key constraint has been the material. They've demonstrated the capability to enrich. So the question would be, is the crossing the threshold that they have got the material and they kind of put it together with the design and with the fuses, and that's crossing the threshold? There is some ambiguity, at least in my mind, as to exactly what one means. But at least in the current discussions, perhaps because of the effects of sanctions, there is and it seems that maybe the administration also is considering some steps that gives more wiggle room for all sides. Maybe they could, in principle, enrich, but has to be certain guarantees with regard to 5%. If Iran, I think, slows its program or agrees to something that is consistent with what they say, which I am skeptical of myself, but they say even to their fellow Muslims. I was having a meeting a few weeks ago with a leader of one of the neighboring countries who talks to them very intensely and frequently, and was saying they are telling us that having a nuclear weapons is religiously forbidden for Iran to have. And now they were taking it very seriously, arguing with me that they were, given what they are saying, they're not seeking it. I thought much more skeptical, because at one stage, after the first Gulf War, I was working in the Pentagon, and I was asked to do a study of not only what lessons we learned from the war over Kuwait, but also what others were learning. And one of the lessons that at that time Rafsanjani was the president of Iran, and they had learned was that you better get nuclear weapons as soon as you can, because if you had nuclear weapons, the U.S. was unlikely to fight the way that we had fought in Iraq against Saddam Hussein. That's Kuwait war, not the recent war. I think they got a bit scared after initially when we went into Iraq, the second one. But it looks to me that they're exploring whether they can get away with getting to nuclear weapons without causing a strike or a war. That's, I think, where they are to buy time. And that's my sense from it. But it's largely, in my view, it's in their hand, given what we're saying. As you know, there are people here in the United States and in other places to say that, look, we managed to deal with the nuclear Soviets, nuclear China, and so on, so we could deter and so forth. That why risk a conflict? But I think, given what we have said, it really depends as to can something be worked out that keeps Iran short of certain thresholds, and I think my own judgment would be at this time, I'm on the more pessimist side of that equation, whether we could.
Great. I just wanted to thank both of you very much. Phil and Zal, thank you.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations. 改变世界.
Change organizations.
Change organizations.
Change the world.